Hi, this is Elliot Haspel and welcome to another edition of Best Practices Weekly. This week we're going to be talking about an article from Teaching Children Mathematics, in which a University of Michigan researcher talks about the issue of number lines and common misunderstandings that students have around placing numbers on number lines, especially when it comes to fractions and decimals. But number lines and number sense are obviously very foundational to all of math, and really if students are confused around the issue of number lines and how numbers relate to one another, it can have some pretty significant impact on their understanding of math in lots of different areas. So the researcher did a study where she worked with 5th graders in particular, and she also reviewed a lot of the other research to talk about what are the most common misunderstandings that students have around number lines and how can we address them as teachers. So the 4 main categories that the researcher found, I'm going to go over one by one. The first is this issue of unconventional notation, and this is sort of the lightest of all of the misunderstandings. And this happens when the student does understand what the target number is, but doesn't really know how to convey it properly. So, for instance, the student might understand that 2 tick marks from 0, between 0 and 1, is 2 parts from 0 and 8 parts away from 1. But in the study, for example, students would list that as 0.02, which is obviously the incorrect notation. So that's just about helping students understand how do we actually label that point. There's also this issue then, the second category, of redefining the unit. And often as teachers, when we talk about fractions or decimals on a number line, we use 0 to 1. Or for younger grade teachers, when we're teaching kids number lines, we'll use 0 to 10 or 0 to 100. Then students start to think that's the only kind of number line, and when you make it longer, it actually confuses them. So, for instance, the researcher found that when you go 0 to 2, students would think that 2 notches there was actually 2 over 20. They didn't understand that even though it's longer in an absolute sense, it doesn't change the value of the tick mark there because it's actually in intervals of 1. The third category is what the author calls the 2-count strategy. And this is when students try to employ a rule in their heads that first you count the number of total tick marks, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and that's got to be the denominator. And then you count the number of tick marks between 0 and the number you're trying to get at, 1, 2, and that's your fraction, 2 over 6. This is obviously incorrect and only works if you have exactly even intervals and if you have 10 intervals between each 0 and 1. So anytime a number line doesn't look precisely like that, with 10 nicely even intervals between 0 and 1, it's not going to work. The last of the categories is an even deeper misunderstanding, and this is what the author calls the 1-count strategy. And this is when students think the way that you do this is you count the number of tick marks to the target number, and that's your denominator, and then you look at the closest whole number, and that's got to be your numerator. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 tick marks over to here, that means that the denominator is 8, and 1 is really close, so that's got to be your numerator. So this is the 1-count strategy. You just do 1 count and then you look for the nearest whole number. It's obviously a deep, deep misunderstanding and confusion, but this is another one that's been displayed commonly by students. So how do we address these as teachers? The author suggests a couple of strategies. First of all, actually we should try to use number lines that have uneven intervals to really push students on the conceptual understanding, so they can't just rely on the fact that there are 10 nice even splits between any 2 numbers. Secondly, what we can do is actually show students examples of number lines that have been labeled incorrectly using one of these 4 kinds of common misunderstandings, and talk with them explicitly about what are common mistakes that other students made, or that students in another class made, or that students last year made, that we want to make sure that we avoid. The third thing is, when you're analyzing student work as a teacher, look for these 4, and see if you can identify if a student is having trouble, which type of misunderstanding do they seem to be displaying, and then taking steps to address those. So, hopefully this is helpful. Thanks for watching, and happy teaching!